Hey class, and welcome to your last full week of pre-algebra. So this week I have made sure to post all of the last assignments you're going to have to finish out this quarter, and your last assignment for next week is just to do a project of your choice. I'll give you a couple options, and you'll also get to choose whatever unit we've taught throughout the whole course of the year. For today, we're going to continue to talk about scatter plots, and we're going to go over that vocabulary just to make sure that you have looked at this slide and you understand each of these words. So first, we're talking about data sets and different options that you could use that data to form a scatter plot. And in the future, we'll talk about a frequency table. And back in sixth grade, you learned about bar graphs and dot plots, right? So, bivariate data, we've heard this word before, and that was because when we first talked about lines, we said that we are comparing two variables, x and y. So, that's all it means. We are comparing values from x-axis to y-axis and how they relate to each other, and we're forming points on a graph. So positive, negative, and no association. I hope those were easy for you last week. And of course, identifying an outlier, forming a trend line, giving it a y equals mx plus b. And your only new vocabulary is a cluster. So basically, when those dots gather together around a particular area or value to form a trend line, that is called a cluster. Easy enough. So next, let's just go over these graphs that I gave you and make sure that you understand how to read and compare the x-axis to the y-axis. So this one was a positive association because if we drew a trend line through this scatter plot, it definitely would be going up and to the right. So let's compare these variables here and see if that makes sense. So this is for height of an athlete versus shoe size. So if the shoe size is increasing, the height of the athlete increases. And as you know, my husband's pretty tall, so he's 6'9" tall. He also wears a size 15 shoe. So you can definitely see that that would correlate to this trend. So we also want to talk about how these dots here are forming a cluster. If we had the trend line right here, we also could say that these dots have a strong association, meaning that they are tightly together and very close to the trend line. Next is the negative graph that we saw from last week. It's talking about a road trip. It has the x-axis time left until you reach your destination, and your y-axis is the speed of the vehicle miles per hour. So as you get closer, your speed is going down. And so this would have a negative association. These dots right here would be your cluster. And if you drew that trend line, you could say that this cluster is very strong. That right there would definitely be an outlier. If you are 1 minute from your destination but going 20 miles per hour, that is an outlier. All right, and lastly, we have no association. So this one was hours at the mall versus money spent. So even if I were to try to draw a line maybe right here, these dots just have too weak of a correlation or association. So you would say that this has no association because the dots are just way too spread out. So let's make sense of this. It's hours spent at the mall versus money spent. So think about that. Just because you go to the mall, does that mean that you're spending money? You know, there have been an occasion or two where you go to the mall and you have no money, right? You're just going to hang out with your friends. And just because you spend an hour or two there doesn't mean that you're spending any money. There's also times where you go there and you want to buy something specific. So you go there for only 15 minutes and you may spend a lot of money. So that's why we say this has no association. Next, we're going to do some sample problems. We're just going to do number 1, 3, and 4 to help you understand clusters, outliers, and strong and weak correlation. But first, we want to identify if this is a linear relationship or not. So, as you know, this year in pre-algebra, we have only talked about lines. Next year in algebra, you're going to talk about non-linear associations. And so if I drew a bell curve right here, that would be more like an x squared problem, and that would be non-linear. So these would definitely form a straight line as your trend line. So that's what you would be looking for in the answer. And let's compare also these graphs before we answer this one. So this graph represents t-shirts. As your temperature goes up, your sales for t-shirts go up. So this has a positive association. Now this graph, as the temperature goes up, the sales for coats goes down. And so this graph would have a negative association. All right, so letter A says graph 1 suggests a linear relationship, while graph 2 suggests a nonlinear relationship. That is not true. Both graphs suggest a linear relationship. B would definitely be your answer. And next up, number 3, we have based on the graph, how many minutes of daily physical activity do you expect from an 80-year-old? So we want to know how to answer this question and how to read this graph. So this graph is titled Physical Activity. The x-axis is your age. So here's our 80. And then your minutes is your y-axis. So this looks like a negative slope. And also, just going over our vocabulary we talked about today, these dots here definitely form a cluster and they are pretty close to our trend line. So that is a strong association. I would say there's no outliers really here. But what a trend line does is if you continue this line on and on and on, we can make an educated guess on what would happen at 80 years old. So this line would probably continue to about right here. So at 80, go to your y-axis, and it would be in between 15 and 30 minutes. Which answer would represent that? Definitely letter C. Last one, number 4. Use a trend line to determine which of the following data points is not an accurate prediction. So if we were to draw a trend line through this graph, it would probably be about right here. And so your x-axis represents hours of sleep, and your y-axis represents your test score. So if I were to ask you what would be a possible y-intercept for this trend line, you could say approximately 65, right? That your line would start here and then go up. Okay, so now let's answer the question, which of these points is not accurate compared to this trend line? So we remember how to graph points. 1 represents your x and 65 represents your y. So go to the right 1 and up 65. Would this be a good possible dot for this trend line? Absolutely. 3 comma 70 over 3 up 70. I would say that's definitely in the vicinity for this trend line. 575 over 5 up to 75. That would definitely be in this cluster. And 760. So if someone got 7 hours of sleep, would they get a 60% on the test? Sure, it's possible, but it would not fit this data set. So the answer, which one would be not as accurate compared to this trend line, is definitely D. And this is our last example to prepare you for your Google form today. So in this lesson, you will learn how to interpret a scatter plot by identifying clusters and outliers. Okay, so we are going to just compare this example. And this table or graph, shows us homework completed and test scores. So your x-axis is homework completed, and then your y-axis are your test scores. So if you complete 10 homework assignments, you should score at least a 60. So in this case, you would draw your trend line here, right? And so if you completed 0 assignments, you should still be able to score a 15%, which, as we know, is not a good enough test score, right? But the more homework assignments you complete, we're trying to determine, does that relate to your test score? So here you would say that these are definitely a cluster on our scatter plot. And then you could determine that this is probably an outlier, right? If if they completed all 10 homework assignments, they only scored a 60%. And you would think that that would be higher than that. So there's obviously a couple of things that could have happened. Maybe they did the 10 assignments but didn't fully understand the material, or something else happened. They got anxiety during the test or whatnot. Okay, so let's look at a slightly different graph, right? So as you look at these dots, you see they're slightly all over the place. We definitely would not consider that a strong correlation. So our x-axis here is still homework completed, but it's comparing it to letters in your last name. So do you think that these two axes should be related? Do they have a positive association, negative, or no association? So, a common mistake is that you would say, yes, it has no association. I agree. But you would still consider this a cluster, and that is not true. If you have no association, then you have no clusters. The other thing would be you also have no outliers. These are just too scattered, too weak of an association to actually say that it's positive or negative or strong. Okay, so again, if you have no association, you have no clusters and no outliers. Hopefully that makes sense. And so back to our problem at hand here, our homework completed compared to our test scores. So you can see here that this is a tight cluster, and if you drew a trend line, that would definitely have a strong association. And obviously that point right there is our outlier, right? So the person who completed 10 assignments but only got a 60. There has to be, an explanation for that. And we talked about those. Okay, so we can definitely conclude, looking at the graph, that doing more homework assignments definitely gets you a higher test grade. So definitely take that advice as we finish up. We only have basically a week of assignments and then one final project next week, and you are all ready for summer. So please contact me if you have any questions at all. I'm available on Zoom at 12 and 2. And then also today's assignment is the Google form. Should be nice and easy, just talking about positive, negative, and no association. If your trend line and clusters are strong or weak, and if you have any outliers, and making sure you know how to identify those. All right, best of luck, and reach out if you need anything. Thanks, guys.